Today's reading comes from Mark's Gospel again, following on from the extended section of teaching that we have in Mark's Gospel, not as large as Matthew, of course, but the parable of the sower, Jesus explaining those parables. Then we've got the lamp under the bowl, the parable of the growing seed, the parable of the mustard seed. Now we have the first of three nature miracles. Jesus calms a storm. So this is Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. On the evening of that same day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they left the crowd. The disciples got into the boat in which Jesus was already sitting, and they took him with them. Other boats were there too. Suddenly, a strong wind blew up, and the waves began to spill over into the boat, so that it was about to fill with water. Jesus was in the back of the boat, sleeping with his head on a pillow. The disciples woke him up and said, "Teacher, don't you care that we're about to die?" Jesus stood up and commanded the wind, "Be quiet," and he said to the waves, "Be still." The wind died down, and there was a great calm. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Why are you frightened? Have you still no faith?" But they were terribly afraid, and said to one another, "Who is this man? Even the wind and the waves obey him." And there, in a nice passage, is Mark's intent spelt out. "Who is this man?" asked the disciples. And when they call out to Jesus in distress, they say, "Teacher." So they're not there yet, are they? They're not there in terms of Jesus being God in human form. "Teacher," they say, "and who is this man?" Now, the story is, of course, completely sprinkled through with Old Testament Jewish thinking. You'll remember how in Genesis, God's Spirit forms the world out of the chaos of the water. So having control over water is seen as very much a divine thing. Water is also a very powerful analogy for chaos and uncontrollable force, unlike the passivity of the land. So the whole idea about a storm brewing up and how Jesus reacts to that storm tells the reader of Mark's Gospel an enormous about who Mark says Jesus is. The fact that in the middle of the storm, Jesus is there asleep with his head on a pillow. So not just, not concerned, but completely out of it, asleep, and everything's fine, even though, as they say, "Don't you care that we're about to die?" Or in one of the other translations, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" Are perishing. Interesting. So they say this to him, and Jesus is there asleep, showing, of course, his complete and utter trust in the fact that things are okay, fundamentally okay. They may be being tossed about on the storms, and we have great songs, don't we, tossed about on the storms of life, that talk about the fact that our own life journey often has these dangerous moments, these moments of being all at sea, literally or metaphorically. Jesus, it's fine. Fundamentally, it's fine because you're in a relationship with God. And that's a really important message for us, but more of that later perhaps. So they say to him, "Don't you care?" Jesus stands up, and in the same words that he used to cast out demonic spirits, the original says, "Shut up." Not just "be quiet" or "be still," but "shut up." And the wind and the waves do. Showing to Mark's readers, beyond any doubt, that this is God. The disciples have a long way to go, though. Who is this man? Even the wind and the waves obey him. It's tricky, isn't it, to respond to what your own eyes see sometimes and to draw proper conclusions from that as opposed to staying in your emotional state. I mean, they, poor people, were, near-death experience, thought themselves a seasoned fisherman, and even they were afraid and scared. Even they thought it was the end game for them. So you can forgive them for not being completely clear in their thinking. But they say to him, yes, "Who is this man?" But Jesus says to them, you see, why are you frightened? Have you still no faith? So, like so many of Mark's passages where it's a story within a story, what we've actually got here is a story about Jesus calming the wind and the waves and people being frightened and then them being fine, but being confused. But actually, of course, the whole story is about, well, where is your trust? Where is your understanding of God in your life? Not that people should be standing or sitting in a boat that's about, apparently, to sink and think, well, life is fine, God loves me. But at the same time, there's a powerful message here about the fact that their trust should always be in God. And in spite of the circumstances, they could and should, I'm not sure I would be any better, certainly, they could and should perhaps have been thinking, yes, but look at the wonderful things we've seen this man do. I mean, he's not active at the moment, but given what he's done with evil spirits, given how he's taught, given the amazing things he's done, given the reaction of the crowd, isn't this man capable of anything? And wouldn't they turn to him first of all and say, so sorry to wake you up, but, how could we believe you could do something about this? Could you? And then, of course, that would have been an even better testimony to their faith. They were not alone. But the interesting thing, I suppose, also in that boat experience, and we're stretching the metaphor here, is that they felt themselves to be all at sea. They felt themselves to be alone, and yet God was with them. And all they had to do was to ask God for help. And not that then we should extrapolate that into saying, well, anytime you've got any kind of distress or trouble, just ask God and God will make it better. But you will then be aware of the powerful presence of God with you. Now, what happens next? Back to the boat and the sea and the wind and the waves. What happens next? You don't know and you can't control. But one thing you will know is that God is with you. And to understand that, irrespective of personal danger, of fear, of doubt, of all the terrible things that can affect us in our lives, is a measure of faith. To totally and utterly understand that God is always with you in the boat of your life as you are thrown about and tossed about and besieged on all sides. To know that God is there with you is a tremendous source of comfort and strength and peace and joy. We are not alone in the midst of all these things, though we may feel we are, and we may choose to ignore what God can do for us to give us that peace and strength, and in fact simply say, well, you didn't save us, you didn't make things better, or I didn't get better, I didn't get wealthier, I didn't live longer, I didn't get to do X, Y, and Z. Those are all understandable reactions. But again, we're not talking here about a measure of a human life through human eyes. We're talking about a relationship with God. And the true profundity of that is that if we know ourselves to be loved by God, if we can truly feel and understand that the God who made all things loves us, then really nothing can distort us from that trust. Nothing can take away that assurance, though we may choose to push it into a room and close the door tightly. It is a fact, just as much as it's a fact that we have a new day and we're breathing and we're alive. It's an incontrovertible part of our lives. And if you think of that carefully, to actually then at any time in your life step back and say, poor me, I am suffering so much and I am all alone, is really just a denial of the truth of your relationship with God. Now, if you've never encountered God, you've never had an opportunity or a chance to let God into your heart and mind and have that experience, have God's Spirit come into your life and assure you of that relationship, of that love, then this is all nonsense, of course, and makes no sense, because you're looking at all of this from the outside in. But if you have experienced God's love in your life, if you have come into an awareness of how much God loves you, then yeah, it's a silliness to think that anything could ever come along and convince you that you are alone and bereft, tossed about, the victim of circumstances. Because that's to think of the world through human eyes. Without God, that's all we have, so it's completely forgivable. But if you have met with the living God, then ultimately that's everything and all to you. And however bad life gets, however fearful we may become, you will know that God is always with you. And in those times of distress, but hopefully also in times of great joy and thankfulness, you will wake that God up. You will give that God a poke, and you'll talk to that God. And you'll ask that God to remind you that God is with you, that you are not alone, regardless of what's happening to you from the outside in.